All right, this is a video where we are going to practice 8 watercolor techniques. You are going to need a large sheet of paper, some watercolors, a large brush and a smaller brush. You're going to need a cup of water, a paper towel, at least one, maybe a few, a little bit of salt, you only need like a pinch, and some tape. Before we start painting, you are going to turn your paper into a grid. So first you're going to fold it in half. Increase it. Fold it in half again. Increase it. And fold it in half one more time. Okay, so that should have created a grid of 8 squares. We're going to do a different technique in each one. Then you're going to label them. Okay, now you're going to set your paper aside for a second and let's get the watercolors ready. I'm going to use the larger brush first. And I'm going to go ahead and get these wet. So you could turn your sink to just like a drip and just put a little tiny bit of water in each one, or you can use your brush and do like 2 drips in each one so that they can go ahead and start getting ready to paint. First we are going to do wet on wet. So because it says wet on wet, that means we have to put down a layer of water. So I'm going to take my bigger brush and I'm going to cover this whole square with water. Now, since we're using drawing paper and not watercolor paper, this won't work as well as it would on watercolor paper because the paper is going to soak up the water quicker than we want it to. But you'll still get the idea, and then when we do this on watercolor paper, it'll work a little better. Okay, so I've covered the whole square with water, and now we're going to create an ombre effect. So we're going to go from dark to light. You can use whatever color you want. I'm going to use blue. And you can either use the blue straight out of here, or you can mix a new blue sort of like on top on the lid. So I think I'm going to do kind of both. I'm going to mix blue that has a little bit of purple in it. Okay, then you're just going to go straight across the top, and then without re-dipping your brush in your paint, you're going to keep going down and see how it gets lighter and lighter because there's less paint on your brush. And then I kind of ran out of paint, so I'm going to do that again. And having the water on there is what it gives it that nice smooth effect. Like look, my paper started to dry down here, so it's not as smooth anymore. And this is called a gradient, where it fades from dark to light. Or you could call it ombre or fading, whatever you want. I'm going to go over mine one more time just so it's nice and dark. So I dipped it in color at the top, and then I just kept using the same brush without getting new water. Although mine was drying out, so I just dipped my brush in plain water. Okay, and that fades it a little bit. This is a good technique to use on a sky area or maybe a ground, anywhere where you have a big smooth area that you just want to kind of look flat and fade from one color to another. Okay, next we're going to do wet on dry. And before you actually start painting, one thing about watercolors that's very important is that you use enough water. If you were to just gouge the paint straight out of these little trays, that would be too thick. And that's how, and this would give you more of a look of like acrylic or something. The look you want with watercolor is very watery, okay? So you should really hardly ever use paint straight out of the palette, with the exception of if you're painting on an area that's already wet, like what we just did. For the rest of the time, you always want to mix on the lid, and think about what you're painting with should be 90% water and 10% paint. Okay, so you should have a lot of water mixed in. You want to make sure you have water over here that's clean. You might have to dump this out and refill it several times throughout this. And then you also want to have your paper towel ready so that as you need to dry your brush in between colors, you can. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is practice maybe like a tree limb. Okay, so I'm going to make brown. And you don't really ever want to use the colors straight out of the palette. You want to create your own version. So I'm going to put some water here, and I'm going to get brown paint and mix it up here, and then I'm going to make my own version of brown. So I'm going to add in maybe some green. And maybe some orange. Okay. Usually if you use the colors straight out of the palette, it's pretty obvious because it looks like you only use these colors, and it just takes your painting to a higher level if you try and never use these colors straight out of here. If you always kind of mix at least two together, it'll just automatically elevate your painting and give it a nicer color scheme. Okay, so now I've got my color mixed, and what I'm going to do is also think about what part of the brush I'm using. So when I start, I'm going to be pressing a little bit harder, and I'm going to be pressing so that the middle of my brush is touching the paper, and when I get to the tip, I'm going to barely touch my brush at all so that only the tip is touching. You should never have the metal touching. Okay? You should never be pressing so hard that the metal is touching the paper. So notice how I'm going to go this direction. So I'm turning my hand. Whoops, I dripped. I'm turning my hand so that the bristles can flow behind the direction I'm pulling the paintbrush. And I'm going to press a little bit harder, and then I'm going to lift it up so that it goes to a point. So try that again. Press down and then slowly lift up, and see how far you can drag your point out. And then just create like a branch. Notice how when you are painting on dry paper that the edge stays really crisp, whereas when we painted on wet paper it blurred together. Now we're going to do what's called dry brush. And dry brush is where you use a brush that does not have tons of water on it. Okay, you have to have a little water because it's watercolors, but not much. So I'm going to use dry brush to practice doing grass. So I'll probably use a little bit of the brown, but I'm also going to make a green over here. And I'm going to actually put a little of the brown in the green. Okay. And then I'm going to get my brush really dry. And I even want to let the bristles fan out a little bit like this. Okay, then I'm only going to put paint on the tips. So my breast is still fanned out. And then I'm going to flick my wrist. I'm going to only touch the very tip down to the paper, and I'm going to sort of flick my wrist upwards. And it'll look grassy. Now the trick to grass is using several colors, because if you look at grass outside, even though your brain thinks green, there's actually like light greens and dark greens, and there's browns and all different colors. I didn't get that dry enough. So try layering several colors together to give the illusion of grass. The other place you might use this is if you were doing, for example, an aspen tree. You might use this to show all of the horizontal sort of ridges and like rough spots that aspens have. And so I'm going to use black for that. And then I'm going to dry my brush, and I'm going to spread the bristles into a fan. And you could just hold them like this too if you're having a hard time getting them to stay. And then I'm going to do just some quick edges like this, where I set it down and then flick my wrist to the right. And it kind of looks like an aspen tree. Okay, the other type of dry brush, this dry brush was all about flicking, right? Whereas the other type of dry brush is going up and down. So this is what's really good for like pine trees is when I like to use it. So you can make another green. Maybe I'll make like more of a bluish green. I'll mix these two together. Maybe I'll put a tiny bit of black in there to make it darker. Okay. And then I'm going to dry my brush off because I want to be able to separate it in so that there's like bristles poking out. Okay. Then I'm going to get the tips of my bristles wet, and I'm going to start by planning out where the tree trunk would be. So I'm just doing up and down. And then I'm going to plan out where I want the base of the tree to be. Okay, so now you have kind of a basic triangle planned out, and you're going to start at the top and then just kind of do zigzags. And you don't want it to be too perfect of a triangle or it'll look fake. It'll look like a store-bought tree. You know, because trees are like dealing with their limbs dying and weather, and they're never really perfect. Notice how see-through my paint is. That's on purpose, okay? With watercolor, you always want your paint to be pretty see-through. You can layer it up so that it gets darker, but you don't ever really want it to be dark to begin with. Okay, now I'm going to do another layer on top to give it some depth of a different color. So you could do like a darker green or maybe like a yellowish green. I'm going to do, I think, like blue actually. Maybe I'll try out this sky blue and see what this looks like. And I think this will look really nice layered together with the green. Okay, so I'm going to dry my brush again, spread my bristles out. I'll dry my brush better first. Spread my bristles out, just get it on the tips, and then I'm going to layer it up. Yeah, that looks pretty sweet, huh? Now we're going to do scraping. This is what I like to do to show texture on tree trunks. And what it is when it's kind of like you start with the wet on dry, and then while it's still wet, you go back and scrape with the back of your paintbrush. So I'm going to do a tree trunk. Pretend this is my tree trunk right here. I'm going to make the edge a little darker to make it look 3D. Okay, and then while it's still wet, I'm going to use the back of my paintbrush, and I'm just kind of doing zigzaggy motions. And what happens is the paint flows into the area where I scraped a little bit. I'm not pressing very hard at all. And the paint gets a little bit darker in that spot. You can try another version too if you wanted, like if you wanted to see what it would look like for the aspen tree, you could take very watered down black. I would recommend not really using the white ever, because it won't really work the way you're used to white weight paint working. If you want something to be white, it should just be left the white of the paper. So like an aspen, for example, I'm going to just use very watered down black so that it's just really light. And then I'm going to try drawing those horizontal lines, and then they'll just be slightly darker. Kind of look like eyelashes. So this might be a good starting base for an aspen tree, and then going back and doing, after it's dry, doing the dry brush on top. Okay, now we are going to do tape, a tape resist. Now we're going to do a tape resist. So you'll need a piece of tape that's, I don't know, about this long. And I'm actually going to tear mine in half long ways. You can try doing this too if you want, because this is what we're going to do for the final. I'm going to do about like that. And then before I put it down on here, this is very sticky, so it would tear the paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on something cotton, like jeans or a t-shirt or a fleece in my case, and pull it up. And then now if you look closely, you'll see that there is lots of little fibers on there, and that'll make it less sticky. And I'm actually going to do it again because that didn't pull up many fibers. There we go. My jeans got some more lint. All right, so you only want it medium sticky. And then I'm going to put it down on the paper. And this is what we're going to do on the final for the main part of the tree. And then we'll go over it and do the sky. So let's practice that. And it won't work as well on drawing paper, but do your best. So what I'm going to do is a wet on wet in the background. So I first have to get it all wet. And then I'm going to try out a sunset sky behind it. So I'll do like maybe a reddish orange fading into yellow. Now for the yellow, I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to start at the bottom and then go upwards. And they should fade together. Now resist the temptation to take your tape up right now, because your paper will definitely tear. It has to be 100% dry before you can pull the tape up and have the paper not rip, and even then sometimes it still rips. So I would recommend waiting until tomorrow to pull this tape up. All right, the last two are pretty quick. Now we're going to do paper towel paint removal. So you want to get your paper towel ready, because you have to be quick. So tear off a little piece and then wad it up, and then we're going to be doing this with it to do clouds. Okay, so I'm going to put some water down to pretend this is the sky, and then you have to be fast. So I'm going to, sorry you can't see my paint, I'm going to put some blue down for the sky, and then I'm immediately going to go back and do some paper towel blotting to give the illusion of clouds. And remember, you want your clouds to kind of be flat on the bottom and poofier on the top. If you waited too long to do the paper towel, just try again in another spot. For the last one, I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of salt ready. You don't need much. That should be plenty. Okay? And then salt is really good for creating like a grainy texture on the ground. And what happens with the salt is it sort of resists, it makes the paint flow away from it in that spot, and it gives the illusion of like gravel or maybe foam or bubbles. Or just general dirt. And so we'll use this on the ground area when we do our final paintings. So you could try out some like browns and oranges and greens if you want right now. Okay, so I'm mixing some new colors on my lid. And then on the ground, you always do only horizontal brush strokes. And it just kind of makes it look more like the ground. Okay, so after you've got your ground colors on there, then you're going to sprinkle the salt around and leave it until it dries. And you can either sprinkle it evenly, or maybe you want some areas to look smoother and others to look grainier, so you could do like spots where it's thicker, whatever you want. Try it out, and so that way you can see what it'll look like before you start your final. Look, I even had too much. I don't need this. That's all. These are 8 watercolor techniques that you can use in a landscape.